Muffled laughter, whispers, and in the middle of it all, my name tangled with a word that burned like a hot iron: useless. It felt as if every glance at that family gathering weighed down on me, reducing me to nothing in front of the very people I loved most. They pretended I hadn't heard, but every syllable echoed inside me, tearing apart what was left of my pride. In that moment, I didn't respond. I kept silent. Outwardly, I let them believe I was too fragile to fight back. But inside, something began to grow, a plan, silent, calculated, almost invisible to them. If they saw me as a broken man, then I would use that very impression against them. What no one imagined was that while they laughed at my expense, I was already designing the moment when every single one of those mouths would fall silent. And when that moment came, it was like watching the weight of their ingratitude turn back against them. My pain, the one they mocked, became the fuel for the sweetest victory of my life. This is my story. I'm Owen Harris, and today you'll discover how a single word, useless, became the spark for a revenge no one will ever forget. But before I continue, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. Has anyone in your own family ever doubted you or mocked your life's journey? I want to hear your story, and before I reveal the silent plan that turned into my sweet revenge, I need to take you back to the beginning. You need to understand who I was before that humiliating moment, and why they reached the cruel conclusion that I was nothing but useless. Only then will you grasp the strength that rose within me, the strength to turn every insult, every scornful laugh, and every unjust word into a response that would echo forever among those who tried to humiliate me. Let me start with who I was before that November evening in 2023 that changed everything. My name is Owen Harris, and for 35 years, I walked through the gates of Midwest manufacturing every morning at 6:30 sharp. Rain or shine, blizzard or heat wave, I was there. As a production supervisor, I oversaw 3 shifts, managed 47 employees, and helped keep one of Detroit's last remaining factories running when everyone said American manufacturing was dead. I wasn't born into privilege. My father worked construction until his back gave out when I was 16. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families on the other side of town. They taught me that respect wasn't given. It was earned through sweat, consistency, and keeping your word. Values that I carried into every aspect of my life. In 1985, I met Sarah at a church potluck dinner. She was 24, working as a nurse at Detroit General, with auburn hair that caught the light just right and a laugh that made everything else fade away. We married 8 months later in a small ceremony that cost more than we could afford, but less than the happiness we felt. Sarah and I built our life brick by brick. We bought a modest 2-story house in Warren, Michigan, with a small backyard where we dreamed of watching our children play. The mortgage payments were tight, but we made it work. I took on overtime whenever possible, and Sarah picked up weekend shifts at the hospital. By 1988, we had our first child, Michael. 2 years later came Rebecca, and in 1993, our youngest, David, completed our family. Those were the golden years. Sunday barbecues in the backyard, little league games where I coached Michael's team, dance recitals where Rebecca twirled in pink tutus, and bedtime stories that David demanded I read in different voices for each character. Sarah was the heart of our home. She remembered every birthday, organized every holiday gathering, and somehow made our modest income stretch to cover everything our children needed. While I provided the stability, she provided the warmth that turned our house into a home. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. In 2010, Sarah started experiencing headaches. At first, we attributed them to stress. Rebecca was starting college, Michael was getting married, and David was in his senior year of high school. Sarah was juggling her nursing job with helping plan Michael's wedding and worrying about college tuition costs. The headaches got worse. Then came the dizzy spells, the moments where she'd forget simple words, the nights when she'd wake up confused about where she was. After months of doctor visits and tests that drained our savings, we got the diagnosis that shattered our world: early onset Alzheimer's disease. Sarah was only 49 years old. The next 4 years were the hardest of my life. I watched the woman I loved, the brilliant nurse who could remember every patient's medication schedule, the mother who never missed a school event, the wife who knew exactly how I liked my coffee, slowly fade away. Some days she recognized me, other days I was a stranger in her own home. I refused to put her in a facility. This was my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. I arranged for home care during the day while I worked, and I took care of her myself every evening and weekend. The kids helped when they could, but they had their own lives, their own families to worry about. Sarah passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning in March 2014. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath, and for a moment, just a moment, her eyes cleared and she whispered my name one final time. The funeral was everything Sarah would have wanted: flowers from our garden, hymns sung by the church choir, and stories shared by the dozens of lives she'd touched as a nurse. Michael, Rebecca, and David each spoke about their mother with tears in their eyes, promising they'd take care of me just like I'd taken care of her. For a while, they kept that promise. Michael and his wife Jennifer invited me for Sunday dinners. Rebecca called every Tuesday evening to check on me. David, who was working as an electrician by then, would stop by on weekends to help with house repairs and yard work. I felt surrounded by love, supported by the family Sarah and I had raised together, but gradually things began to change. It started small. Sunday dinners became every other Sunday, then once a month. Rebecca's Tuesday calls became brief check-ins. "Just making sure you're okay, Dad. I'm really busy with the kids." David's weekend visits turned into quick stops to borrow tools that somehow never made it back to my garage. I told myself they were just busy. Michael had been promoted to regional sales manager and was traveling more. Rebecca was raising 3 young children while working part-time as a substitute teacher. David had started his own electrical contracting business and was working long hours to get it off the ground. But the distance wasn't just about time. It was about how they looked at me, how they spoke to me, how they made decisions about family gatherings without consulting me. Slowly, I went from being the family patriarch to being an obligation they managed around their schedules. The real change came when I retired in 2020. After 35 years at Midwest Manufacturing, I finally hung up my hard hat and supervisor badge. The company gave me a gold watch and a pension that would keep me comfortable, but not wealthy. I was 61, healthy, and looking forward to having time for all the things I'd put off while working: traveling, reading, maybe learning to fish properly. But instead of seeing my retirement as an opportunity for us to spend more time together, my children seemed to view it as the beginning of my decline. Suddenly, I wasn't Owen Harris, the man who'd successfully supervised a factory floor for 3 decades. I was just an old man with too much time on his hands. The comments started subtly. "Dad, maybe you shouldn't be driving at night anymore." "Dad, are you sure you can handle maintaining that big house by yourself?" "Dad, we're worried about you being lonely." I wasn't lonely. I had my routines, my neighbors, my small circle of retired friends who met for coffee every Thursday morning at Mel's Diner. I was reading more books than I'd read in 20 years, taking evening walks through the neighborhood, and actually enjoying the slower pace of life. But in their eyes, I was becoming a problem to be solved. The breaking point came on that November evening in 2023. Rebecca had suggested we all get together for an early Thanksgiving dinner at Michael's house. "It'll be easier for everyone," she'd said. "The kids can play together and we can all catch up." I arrived at Michael's suburban home in Troy at exactly 4 p.m., carrying a pecan pie I'd bought from the bakery Sarah and I used to frequent. The house was warm and filled with the sounds of family: Children laughing, football on the television, the clatter of dishes being prepared in the kitchen. But something felt different from the moment I walked in. The conversation seemed forced, the smiles a little too bright. When I tried to help in the kitchen, Jennifer gently but firmly steered me toward the living room. "Just relax, Owen. You're the guest today." Guest in my own family. After dinner, as the dishes were being cleared and the children settled in front of a movie, I went to the bathroom. That's when I heard it, the conversation that would change everything between us forever. I was walking back toward the living room when I heard my name mentioned in the kitchen. Something in the tone made me stop just outside the doorway, hidden from view but close enough to hear every word. "He's getting worse," Rebecca was saying, her voice carrying that particular mix of frustration and pity that I'd learned to recognize. "Did you see how confused he got when Emma asked him about his job? He kept talking about the factory like he was still working there." "Mom's right," David chimed in. "And did you notice how he's been repeating the same stories? Last week he told me about fixing Mrs. Peterson's fence 3 different times in one conversation." Michael's voice was quieter, but his words cut deeper. "Jennifer and I have been talking about it. We think it might be time to start looking at options. Dad's not taking care of himself the way he should, and that house is too big for him to manage alone." "What kind of options?" Rebecca asked. "Assisted living facilities," Jennifer replied. "There are some nice ones about an hour outside the city, more affordable than the places in town, and they have activities to keep seniors engaged." The room went quiet for a moment, and then David spoke the words that burned themselves into my memory. "I hate to say it, but Dad's becoming, well, useless. He can't help with anything anymore. He just sits around feeling sorry for himself, and honestly, he's starting to become a burden." Useless. Burden. The words hit me like physical blows. I stood frozen in that hallway, listening to my own children, the babies I'd rocked to sleep, the toddlers I'd taught to ride bicycles, the teenagers I'd helped with homework and dating advice, discuss me like I was a problem to be disposed of. "The financial side is what worries me most," Michael continued. "Dad's got that pension and some savings, but if he keeps spending money on unnecessary things, there won't be much left for us to, well, for inheritance planning." "What kind of unnecessary things?" Rebecca asked. "Last month he bought a new television, a 55-inch smart TV. Does a man living alone really need something like that? And he's been talking about taking a cruise, maybe visiting Alaska. That's thousands of dollars that could be better used." "Better used for what?" David's voice carried a hint of greed that made my stomach turn. "For securing his future care," Jennifer said smoothly. "And for making sure there's something left for his grandchildren's college funds." They weren't talking about my well-being. They were talking about my money and how to make sure I didn't spend too much of it before they could get their hands on it. "So what's the plan?" Rebecca asked. "We approach him carefully," Michael replied. "Don't make it seem like we're ganging up on him. Frame it as concern for his safety and happiness. Maybe start with suggesting he downsize to a smaller place, something easier to maintain, then gradually introduce the idea of assisted living." "And if he resists?" David asked. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Michael said. "But honestly, Dad's not as sharp as he used to be. If we present it right, he'll probably go along with whatever we suggest." Not as sharp. Another dagger to my heart. I remained hidden in that hallway for another 10 minutes, listening to them plan my future like I was already gone. They discussed which assisted living facilities were cheapest, how to handle the sale of my house, and what to do with my belongings. They talked about me like I was a child who couldn't make his own decisions, a burden they were obligated to manage. When I finally returned to the living room, I was a different man than the one who had left to use the bathroom. But I didn't let it show. I smiled, made small talk about the weather, and thanked them for a lovely dinner. I hugged my grandchildren, told Michael and Jennifer how much I appreciated their hospitality, and drove home in my too dangerous for nighttime driving. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. The father who had spent decades putting his children's needs before his own, who had worked overtime to pay for their educations, who had sacrificed his own dreams to ensure theirs could come true, was gone. In his place was a man who finally understood that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones most eager to write your obituary while you're still breathing. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and Sarah's old notebook where she used to plan our family events. But instead of planning gatherings, I began planning something else entirely. If my children thought I was useless, confused, and easy to manipulate, then I would show them exactly what a sharp, determined man could accomplish when he stopped, pretending to be anything less than what he was. The old Owen Harris, the grateful father, the accommodating patriarch, the man who always put family first, had died in Michael's hallway that November evening. The Owen Harris who emerged was someone they had never met before, and they were about to discover that underestimating a man who had successfully managed people and problems for 35 years was the biggest mistake they would ever make. The morning after that devastating dinner, I woke up at 5:30 a.m., the same time I'd awakened for 35 years at the factory. But instead of the familiar routine of shower, coffee, and heading to work, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, writing down everything I could remember about the conversation I'd overheard. David's words echoed. In my mind, Dad's becoming useless. Rebecca's casual dismissal, he keeps repeating the same stories. Michael's calculated assessment, he's not as sharp as he used to be. And Jennifer's cold financial planning, better used for securing his future care. Each memory felt like a fresh wound, but I forced myself to write it all down. If I was going to respond to this betrayal, I needed to be methodical, precise, and absolutely certain of my facts. The November morning was crisp and clear, typical Michigan weather that reminded me of countless other mornings when Sarah would be making breakfast while I read the newspaper. She used to tease me about my habit of making lists for everything. Grocery lists, household repair lists, weekend project lists. "Owen," she'd say with that smile that could light up our entire kitchen, "you organize your thoughts like you organize your work crews." If only she could see the list I was making now. I spent the entire morning documenting not just what I'd heard the night before, but patterns I'd been too blind or too trusting to notice over the past few years. The gradual reduction in family and contact, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, the dismissive looks when I expressed opinions about current events or family decisions. How long had they been viewing me as incompetent? How many family discussions had taken place without me, about me? By noon, I had 3 pages of observations that painted a clear picture. My children had already written me off as a declining old man whose primary value was the inheritance they expected to receive when I died. The irony was almost laughable. I was 61 years old, in excellent health, with a sharp mind that had successfully managed complex manufacturing operations for decades. I had a comfortable pension, a paid-off house, and enough savings to live independently for the rest of my life. But because I was retired and occasionally told the same story twice, they had decided I was ready for assisted living. That afternoon, I drove to the downtown Detroit library, something I'd been doing regularly since retirement, but which my children apparently viewed as evidence of my deteriorating social skills. I settled into my usual spot in the business section and began researching. First, I looked up the assisted living facilities Jennifer had mentioned. More affordable than the places in town was a euphemism for warehouses where seniors were parked until they died. The reviews were devastating. Understaffed, over-medicated residents, reports of neglect and abuse. These weren't places you sent someone you loved. These were places you sent someone you wanted to forget about. Next, I researched inheritance laws in Michigan. What I discovered made my blood run cold. If they could establish that I was mentally incompetent, my children could petition for guardianship and gain control of all my assets. The confused behavior they were documenting, the repeated stories they were tracking, the poor decision-making they were claiming, it was all potential evidence in a competency hearing. They weren't just planning to warehouse me. They were building a case to steal everything I'd worked for. I drove home that evening with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of grief that had surrounded me since Sarah's death, the confusion about my role in the family after retirement, the self-doubt about whether I really was becoming a burden, all of it cleared away like morning mist. My children weren't concerned about my well-being. They were concerned about their inheritance, and they were willing to destroy my dignity, my autonomy, and my remaining years to protect their financial interests. But they had made one crucial error in their assessment of the situation. They thought they were dealing with a declining old man who would passively accept whatever they decided for him. What they were actually dealing with was a former supervisor who had spent decades managing people, solving problems, and anticipating challenges before they became crises. That evening, I called my old friend Walter Chen, who had worked as the plant's head of security for 20 years before retiring in 2018. Walter and I had maintained a friendship built on shared coffee breaks and mutual respect. More importantly, Walter had connections throughout Detroit's business community from his previous work in corporate security. Owen. Walter's voice carried genuine warmth when he answered the phone. How are you doing? It's been too long since we've talked. I'm doing well, Walter. Actually, I was hoping we could meet for coffee tomorrow. I have a situation I could use some advice on. Of course. Mel's Diner at 9 a.m.? Like old times? Perfect. And Walter? This conversation needs to stay between us. There was a pause, and when Walter spoke again, his voice carried the professional discretion that had made him valuable in security work. Understood. I'll see you tomorrow? That night I barely slept, but it wasn't the restless sleep of anxiety or depression that had plagued me since Sarah's death. This was the alert wakefulness of a man preparing for battle. I spent those sleepless hours thinking about everything I knew about my children's lives. Information they'd shared freely over the years when they still viewed me as a trusted confidant. Rather than a problem to be managed, Michael's sales territory covered 3 states and he was frequently traveling. But his expense reports, which he'd shown me proudly when he got his promotion, revealed a lifestyle that exceeded his income. The fancy restaurants, luxury hotels, and first-class flights weren't all business expenses. Michael was living beyond his means, and a generous inheritance would solve his financial problems nicely. Rebecca's situation was even more revealing. Her husband Tom had been laid off 6 months ago from his job at the automotive parts factory. They were struggling to maintain their mortgage payments on their suburban home while raising 3 children. Rebecca's part-time teaching income wasn't enough to cover their expenses, and they'd already borrowed against Tom's 401k. They needed money desperately, and they needed it soon. David's electrical contracting business was newer than he'd admitted to the family. Public records would show exactly when he'd incorporated, how many employees he actually had, and whether his business income supported the expensive truck and equipment he'd purchased. I suspected David was in debt up to his eyeballs, using credit to maintain the appearance of success while hoping for a big break. All 3 of my children were in financial trouble. All 3 of them viewed my continued independence as an obstacle to accessing the money they needed. and all three of them had convinced themselves that stealing my autonomy was somehow in my best interest. The next morning, I met Walter at Mel's diner, the same place where we'd grabbed quick breakfasts during shift changes at the factory. Walter looked exactly the same, compact, alert, with grey hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "You look better than I expected," Walter said, as we settled into our usual booth. "Retirement's treating you well." "It was," I replied carefully, "until I discovered that my family has some interesting plans for my future." I told Walter everything. The overheard conversation, the research I'd done, the patterns of behavior I'd identified. Walter listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. By the time I finished, his expression had shifted from concern to professional assessment. "Owen," Walter said slowly, "what you're describing sounds like elder abuse, financial exploitation combined with psychological manipulation. The fact that they're documenting your alleged incompetence suggests they're building a legal case. That's what I'm afraid of. Walter, I need to know more about their financial situations. I need to understand exactly what's motivating this betrayal, and I need to do it without alerting them to my suspicions." Walter smiled grimly. "You want me to run background checks on your own children? I want to know who I'm really dealing with. These aren't the kids I raised, Walter. These are strangers who happen to share my DNA." Walter was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I can get you the information you need. Financial records, business filings, credit reports, all perfectly legal if you know where to look. But Owen, what are you planning to do with this information?" I looked across the diner at the other retired men having their morning coffee, their simple routines and peaceful conversations. A week ago, I thought that's what my retirement would look like. Quiet, predictable, surrounded by family who love me. I'm going to show them that the useless old man they're planning to warehouse is sharper than they ever imagined. And I'm going to make sure they understand the real cost of betraying someone who spent 35 years solving problems they never even knew existed. Walter extended his hand across the table. "Give me 3 days. I'll have everything you need to know about their real situations." As we shook hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that devastating conversation in Michael's kitchen. Hope. Not hope for reconciliation or family healing, but hope for justice. Hope for a response that would be proportional to their betrayal. My children thought they were playing chess with a checkers player. They were about to discover that the factory supervisor who had managed union negotiations, supplier contracts, and crisis management for 3 decades had simply been waiting for the right problem to solve. The game was beginning, and they didn't even know they were playing. 3 days later, Walter called at exactly 8 a.m. "Owen, we need to meet, and you're going to want to sit down for this conversation." An hour later, I was back at Mel's diner, but this time Walter carried a manila folder that he placed carefully on the table between us. His expression was grim, the look of a security professional who'd uncovered something worse than expected. "Before I show you this," Walter said quietly, "I need you to understand that what I found goes beyond family financial struggles. Your children aren't just hoping for an inheritance, Owen. They're counting on it to avoid some serious consequences." He opened the folder and spread out documents like a hand of cards that revealed a losing game. "Let's start with Michael." The first set of papers showed credit card statements, loan documents, and financial records that painted a devastating picture. Michael wasn't just living beyond his means. He was drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out at $87,000. A second mortgage on his house that he'd hidden from Jennifer. A personal loan from his company's credit union that violated his employment contract. "It gets worse," Walter continued. "Michael's been filing false expense reports with his company. Those business dinners and client entertainment expenses, Half of them were personal expenses he charged to the company. If his employer discovers this, he's not just looking at termination, he's looking at fraud charges. I stared at the documents, recognizing my son's signature on papers that proved he'd become someone I no longer knew. How much does he owe total? Close to $200,000. And Owen, his house payment alone is $3,400 a month. On his legitimate salary, he can't afford to keep his family in that house for more than 6 months. Walter pulled out a second set of documents. Rebecca's situation is different, but equally desperate. Rebecca and Tom weren't just struggling with his unemployment. They'd borrowed against everything they owned, their house, their cars, even their children's college savings accounts. Worse, they'd gotten involved with a multi-level marketing scheme that had cost them $15,000 in inventory they couldn't sell. Tom's unemployment benefits run out next month, Walter explained. They're 3 payments behind on their mortgage. Without immediate help, they're looking at foreclosure by spring. The third set of documents revealed David's situation, and it was perhaps the most shocking of all. David's electrical contracting business was completely fictional. He'd incorporated the company, printed business cards, and bought expensive equipment, but he'd never secured a single legitimate contract. "Your youngest son has been running a contracting scam," Walter said bluntly. "He collects deposits from homeowners for electrical work, then disappears without doing the job. He's facing multiple lawsuits and potential criminal charges. The state licensing board is investigating him for operating without proper credentials." I sat back in the booth, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. These weren't just financial difficulties. These were moral and legal failures that revealed character flaws I'd never suspected. "Walter, how did they hide all of this from me?" "Because you trusted them, and they exploited that trust. But Owen, there's more. I found evidence that they've been meeting regularly to discuss your situation. This isn't 3 separate financial crises. This is a coordinated effort to solve their problems using your assets." Walter pulled out printed emails that he'd somehow obtained. Messages between my children discussing my declining mental state, my dangerous living situation, and their responsibility to step in before something tragic happens. The emails revealed the depth of their conspiracy. They'd been documenting everything they claimed showed my incompetence. The new television purchase, my interest in taking a cruise, my habit of telling the same stories. They'd even contacted an elder law attorney to discuss guardianship procedures. "They're building a case to have you declared incompetent," Walter confirmed. "Once they establish guardianship, they can control your finances, sell your house, and institutionalize you against your will. And Owen, they've been planning this for months." I read through the emails with growing disbelief and rage, my own children discussing me like I was already mentally gone, calculating how to access my pension and savings, planning to warehouse me in the cheapest facility they could find. One email from Rebecca to her brothers was particularly chilling. "Dad's getting suspicious about our meetings. We need to move faster before he figures out what we're planning. Once we have guardianship, it won't matter if he objects." "How did you get these emails?" I asked Walter. Walter smiled grimly. "Let's just say that people who are planning to defraud, their father should use better password security on their family shared computer." I closed the folder and sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of their betrayal. My children weren't just ungrateful or misguided. They were criminals who saw me as their solution to avoiding the consequences of their own poor choices. "Walter, I need your help with something else. I need to know everything about their daily routines, their habits, their schedules, and I need to know it without them realizing they're being watched. Owen, what are you planning?" I looked around the diner at the other retired men, enjoying their peaceful morning coffee, men whose children probably called them on Sundays and visited for holidays. Men whose families didn't view them as ATMs or obstacles to wealth. I'm planning to show them what happens when you underestimate someone who spent 35 years anticipating problems and solving them before they became disasters. Walter leaned forward. You want to know their vulnerabilities. I want to know everything. Their schedules, their habits, their fears, their weaknesses. If they're going to treat me like an enemy, then I'm going to respond like one. And then what? What's your end game here? I thought about Sarah, about the promises I'd made to her to always put our children first, to always be the father they needed. But Sarah couldn't have imagined that our children would grow up to become people who would steal from their own father. My end game is justice, Walter. They want to take everything I've worked for and lock me away like a prisoner. They think I'm too weak, too confused, and too grateful for their attention to fight back. I stood up and put on my coat, feeling more determined than I had since the day I retired. They're about to learn that they've declared war on someone. Who knows how to win? Walter gathered up the documents and handed me the folder. Give me one more week. I'll have their complete profiles, schedules, routines, contacts, everything you need to know about their real lives. As I drove home, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard just 4 days ago. David calling me useless, Michael questioning my mental sharpness, Rebecca dismissing my stories as repetitive nonsense. They thought they were dealing with a declining old man who would passively accept whatever fate they chose for him. What they were actually facing was a former supervisor who had successfully managed complex operations, difficult personalities, and crisis situations for 35 years. The old Owen Harris, the trusting father, the grateful patriarch, was gone forever. The Owen Harris they were about to meet had spent decades solving problems much more complicated than 3 adult children who thought they were smarter than their father. And the first lesson I was going to teach them was simple. Never underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The war had begun, and they didn't even know they were fighting. What do you think? Could you have stayed silent and patient if you discovered your own children plotting against you like this? Or would you have confronted them immediately? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Walter's second report arrived exactly 1 week later, and it was even more comprehensive than I'd hoped. My children had made themselves remarkably easy to monitor, largely because they'd grown careless in their conspiracy. When you're convinced you're dealing with a confused old man, you don't bother with operational security. Michael followed the same routine every week. Monday through Wednesday, he worked from his home office, making sales calls and filing reports. Thursday and Friday, he traveled to client meetings, or at least that's what he told Jennifer. Walter's investigation revealed that many of these client meetings were actually visits to casinos in neighboring states, where Michael was trying to gamble his way out of debt. Rebecca's schedule revolved around her children's activities and her substitute teaching assignments. But Walter had discovered something interesting about her evening routine. 3 nights a week, she left her house at 7 p.m., telling Tom she was attending book club meetings or PTA planning sessions. In reality, she was meeting with representatives from that multi-level marketing company, desperately trying to recruit new victims to help her recoup her losses. David's pattern was the most predictable. Every morning at 8 a.m., he left his apartment dressed in work clothes and drove to various neighborhoods around Detroit. He'd spend the day knocking on doors, posing as a licensed contractor, collecting deposits for work he never intended to complete. His victims were usually elderly homeowners who trusted a young man with a professional appearance and a convincing story about electrical safety issues. But Walter had uncovered something else, something that would prove crucial to my plans. All 3 of my children had been meeting together every Tuesday evening at a restaurant called Tony's Tavern on the outskirts of town. They chose this location because it was far from their usual social circles, and they always requested a corner booth where they could speak privately. "They're not just siblings having dinner," Walter explained when he delivered the report. "These are strategy sessions. They discuss your behavior, plan their next moves, and coordinate their stories about your alleged mental decline." Walter had even managed to get photographs of these meetings, showing my children huddled over documents, their expressions intense and calculating. In one particularly damning photo, Rebecca was pointing to what appeared to be financial paperwork, while Michael and David leaned in to listen. "Owen, I have to ask, what are you planning to do with all this information?" I'd been thinking about that question for days. My initial reaction had been pure anger, a desire for immediate confrontation and dramatic revelation. But 35 years of management experience had taught me that emotional reactions rarely produce the best outcomes. Complex problems required strategic solutions. "I'm going to give them exactly what they think they want," I said finally. Walter looked puzzled. "You're going to make it easy for them." "I'm going to appear to make it easy for them." "Walter, they're convinced I'm becoming incompetent, right? So I'm going to start acting more incompetent. I'm going to give them evidence that seems to support their narrative, while actually documenting everything they do in response." Over the next few days, I began implementing what I privately called Operation Confirmation Bias. If my children wanted to believe I was declining mentally, I would give them behavior that seemed to confirm their suspicions while actually collecting evidence of their exploitation. It started with small things. When Rebecca called on Tuesday evening, her weekly check-in call that had become increasingly perfunctory, I acted slightly confused about dates and appointments. "Rebecca, honey, remind me what day Thanksgiving is this year." I keep thinking, "It's next week, but that doesn't seem right." "Dad, Thanksgiving is still 3 weeks away. Are you feeling okay? You seem a little mixed up about time lately." "Oh, of course. I don't know why I thought. Well, anyway, how are the children?" I could hear the note-taking quality in her voice as she filed away another example of my alleged confusion. But what Rebecca didn't know was that I was recording every one of these conversations, building my own documentation of their systematic exploitation of my apparent vulnerability. When Michael stopped by on Saturday morning, an unusually spontaneous visit that suggested their timeline was accelerating, I made sure to appear slightly overwhelmed by simple tasks. "Dad, are you having trouble with the television remote again?" Michael asked, finding me staring at a blank screen with the remote in my hand. "I can't seem to get it to work right," I said, feigning frustration. "All these buttons, and nothing happens the way it used to." Michael took the remote and turned on the TV with obvious satisfaction. "Dad, maybe we should look into getting you something simpler. This smart TV might be too complicated for you to use safely." What Michael didn't realize was that I'd deliberately unplugged the TV before he arrived, then plugged it back in while he was fixing the remote issue. But I let him believe he'd solved a problem caused by my technological incompetence. "You're probably right, son. Things are getting more confusing these days." I watched Michael's expression carefully. There was no concern, no sadness about his father's apparent decline. There was only satisfaction at having more evidence to support his case for my incompetence. David's visit on Sunday afternoon provided an even more revealing test. I had Walter position himself across the street with a camera while I deliberately created a situation that would make me appear forgetful and potentially unsafe. When David arrived, he found me in the garage, looking confused and holding a power drill. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" I thought I needed to fix something, but I can't remember what it was. And this drill, I can't figure out how to make it work." David quickly took the drill from my hands. "Dad, you shouldn't be using power tools if you're feeling confused. You could hurt yourself." "You're probably right. I just thought, well, I can't remember what I thought." What David didn't know was that I'd removed the battery from the drill before he arrived, then found it and reinstalled it while he was lecturing me about safety. The entire performance was designed to make him believe I was becoming dangerously incompetent with tools I'd used expertly for decades, but the real revelation came in David's response. Instead of offering to help me with whatever project I might actually need done, he immediately began questioning me about my daily routines, my driving habits, and my ability to manage household tasks. "Dad, maybe it's time we talked about getting you some help around the house. Someone who could check on you daily, make sure you're safe." "I don't know, David. I've always been independent." "But that's the problem, Dad. Independence isn't worth risking your safety. What if you fell in the garage and no one found you for hours? What if you left the stove on and started a fire?" Each question was designed to establish a record of safety, concerns that could be used in a competency hearing. David wasn't worried about my well-being. He was building a legal case while pretending to be a concerned son. That evening, I sat in my kitchen reviewing the audio recordings of all three encounters. The pattern was unmistakable. My children weren't responding to my apparent decline with love, support, or genuine concern. They were documenting it, exploiting it, and using it to justify their predetermined plan to seize control of my life. The most chilling moment came when I replayed David's conversation. In the background, I could hear him typing on his phone while we talked. He was taking notes during our conversation, creating real-time documentation of my alleged incompetence. But Walter's surveillance photos from that same Sunday revealed something even more disturbing. After leaving my house, David drove straight to Michael's house, where Rebecca's car was already parked in the driveway. They were having an emergency strategy session, probably to discuss the evidence David had just collected. This wasn't a family concerned about an aging patriarch. This was a conspiracy that had moved into active implementation phase. They were no longer just planning to steal my autonomy. They were actively working to make it happen. That night, I made a decision that would have shocked the Owen Harris who existed before that devastating dinner conversation. If my children wanted to play games with an old man's mental competence, I would show them what strategic thinking really looked like. I called Walter at 10 p.m. "Walter, I need surveillance equipment installed in my house. Cameras, audio recording, everything documented and time-stamped. And I need it done while I'm out of the house tomorrow." "Owen, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to let them think they're winning while I document every crime they commit. If they want to build a case for my incompetence, I'm going to build a case for their conspiracy to commit elder abuse, fraud, and theft." There was a long pause. "You realize that once you go down this path, there's no going back to being a family." I looked around my kitchen, at the table where Sarah and I had shared breakfast for 25 years, at the walls covered with photos of family gatherings that had once brought me joy. Those photos now looked like evidence of a life I'd been naive enough to believe was real. "Walter, we stopped being a family the moment they decided I was more valuable as a victim than as a father. Now I'm going to show them what happens when you declare war on someone who actually knows how to fight." The next phase of my plan would require perfect timing, flawless execution, and the kind of strategic patience I'd learned from managing complex manufacturing operations. My children thought they were dealing with a confused old man who would passively accept whatever fate they chose for him. They were about to discover that their father had simply been choosing his battles. And this was one battle they could not win. "Thank you for staying with me through this journey. I promise you the best is yet to come." Walter's security team worked with military precision, while I spent Tuesday morning at the library, establishing my alibi through library computer logs and conversations with the librarians who knew me. They transformed my house into a surveillance center that would have impressed the FBI micro. Cameras were installed in every room, hidden inside smoke detectors, picture frames, and electrical outlets. Audio recording devices were placed throughout the house, sensitive enough to pick up whispered conversations. Motion sensors would activate recording whenever someone entered any room, and everything was connected to a central system that I could monitor remotely from my smartphone. The beauty of this system, Walter explained as he showed me the controls, is that it's completely passive. You don't have to do anything except live your normal life. If your children visit and say or do anything suspicious, it'll all be recorded with timestamps and date stamps that would be admissible in court. But I wasn't planning to wait for them to visit me. Based on Walter's intelligence about their Tuesday evening strategy meetings, I knew they were accelerating their timeline, which meant I needed to accelerate mine. That Tuesday evening, I drove to Tony's Tavern at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before my children's usual arrival time. I positioned myself at the bar with a clear view of their corner booth, ordered a beer I had no intention of drinking, and waited. They arrived at exactly 7 p.m., just as Walter had predicted. Michael carried a briefcase that looked official and expensive. Rebecca had a folder full of papers. David brought his smartphone and a legal pad. They looked like business executives meeting to discuss a merger, not children planning to betray their father. I pulled out my own smartphone and activated the recording app, angling it to pick up their conversation, while appearing to scroll through messages like any other senior citizen struggling with modern technology. What I heard over the next 90 minutes destroyed any remaining hope I had for reconciliation with my children. "The documentation is almost complete," Michael announced, opening his briefcase and spreading papers across the table. "I've got records of Dad's confusion about dates, his trouble with the TV remote, the incident with the power drill. Plus, Jennifer's been keeping notes about his repetitive conversations and apparent memory issues. I've got similar documentation," Rebecca added, consulting her folder. "Phone conversations where he seemed confused about time, instances where he forgot things we'd discussed, observations about his declining personal hygiene and house maintenance." I almost laughed at that last comment. My personal hygiene was fine, and my house was in better condition than any of theirs, but they were willing to fabricate evidence to support their narrative. David leaned forward conspiratorially. "I talked to that lawyer yesterday. He says we have enough evidence to petition for emergency guardianship. We just need one more incident that demonstrates he's a danger to himself or others." "What kind of incident?" Michael asked. "Something with driving would be perfect. If we can document that Dad's having trouble with depth perception or reaction time, that's immediate grounds for removing his license and establishing that he can't live independently." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "And once we have guardianship, we can move him into that facility we looked at. The one in Pontiac is only $3,200 a month, and they have immediate availability. $3,200 a month for a warehouse where seniors were medicated into compliance and forgotten by their families. They'd researched the cheapest option available, not the best care for their father." But the next part of their conversation was even more chilling. "What about his assets?" David asked. "How quickly can we access them once we have control?" Michael consulted his briefcase. "The house should sell for around $180,000 in the current market. His pension continues until death, but we can redirect those payments to cover facility costs with enough left over for administrative expenses." Administrative expenses, a euphemism for siphoning money from my pension to pay their debts. "His savings account has about $85,000, Rebecca added. "Plus, there's a CD that matures next year with another $40,000, and his car should bring $15,000 or so." They'd calculated the value of my entire life down to the last dollar. My house, my savings, my car, even my pension. Everything was just numbers on a spreadsheet to them. "So we're looking at roughly $320,000 total, Michael summarized. "Minus facility costs and legal fees, we should be able to clear about $250,000 within 6 months. "How do we divide it?" David asked. "Equal three-way split," Rebecca replied. "That's about $83,000 each. Enough to solve my mortgage problem, cover Michael's debt consolidation, and give David a fresh start with his business." They'd already spent my money in their minds. They'd calculated exactly how my life savings would solve their financial problems. And they'd done it with the casual efficiency of accountants, dividing assets in a bankruptcy proceeding. But the most devastating moment came when Rebecca raised a concern about my health. "What if Dad lives longer than expected? The lawyer said some people in assisted living can survive for years, even decades. What if he outlives our projections?" Michael's response revealed the depth of their callousness. "The facility we're looking at has flexible care protocols. They're very responsive to family requests about comfort measures and end-of-life decisions. If Dad becomes too much of a financial burden, there are options for managing that situation." They were discussing ways to ensure I wouldn't live long enough to exhaust the money they planned to steal. I sat at that bar for another 30 minutes after they left, staring at my untouched beer and processing what I'd heard. My children weren't just planning to steal my money and warehouse me against my will. They were discussing how to manage my death to maximize their financial benefit. The old Owen Harris would have been heartbroken. The new Owen Harris was simply calculating the most effective response to their threat. I drove home that night with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since my factory days. When faced with a complex problem, you gathered intelligence, identified your resources, and developed a solution that addressed every aspect of the challenge. My children had made their choice. They decided to view me as an obstacle to wealth rather than as a father who deserved love and respect. They'd chosen to see my retirement years as an inconvenience to their financial plans, rather than as time we could have spent building deeper relationships. Now I would show them the consequences of that choice. Back home, I reviewed the surveillance footage from my house while I'd been gone. As expected, the motion sensors hadn't been triggered. My children were too busy planning my destruction to actually visit me. But tomorrow, I would give them exactly the incident they needed to move forward with their guardianship petition. And, while they thought they were documenting my incompetence, I would be documenting their conspiracy to commit elder abuse, fraud, and potentially much worse. I called Walter at 11:30 p.m. "Walter, tomorrow I'm going to give them the driving incident they want. I need you to have surveillance positioned to record everything that happens." "Owen, what exactly are you planning?" "I'm planning to look like exactly the kind of confused old man who shouldn't be driving. And I'm planning to make sure my concerned children's response is documented in detail." And then I looked around my house, my home for 30 years, filled with memories of raising 3 children who had grown up to become strangers willing to steal from their own father. Then I'm going to show them what happens when you underestimate someone who spent 35 years solving problems they never knew existed. The game was moving into its final phase, and my children still thought they were playing against a confused old man who would gratefully accept whatever they decided for him. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Wednesday morning dawned. Gray and cold, typical November weather in Michigan. Perfect conditions for what I had planned. I dressed carefully in old clothes that would make me appear more frail than I actually was, and I made sure to skip my morning shave to look slightly unkempt. If my children wanted evidence of an incompetent old man, I would give them a performance they would never forget. At 9:30 a.m., I called Michael's office. "Michael, it's Dad. I'm having some trouble with my car, and I wondered if you could meet me at the grocery store parking lot on Maple Street. I think something's wrong with the steering, but I'm not sure." The concern in Michael's voice was perfectly acted. "Dad, if you're having car trouble, you shouldn't be driving. Why don't you wait at home and I'll come pick you up?" No, I'm already here. I just need someone to take a look at it. Can you meet me in about 15 minutes? I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. This was exactly the kind of incident he'd been hoping for. "Of course, Dad. I'll be right there. Just try not to drive anywhere else until I get there. Okay?" What Michael didn't know was that Walter's surveillance team was already positioned around the grocery store parking lot with telephoto cameras. Every moment of our encounter would be recorded from multiple angles. At 9:45 a.m., I drove to the parking lot and deliberately positioned my car at an odd angle across 2 parking spaces. Then I got out and stood beside it, looking confused and slightly distressed. To any observer, I appeared to be an elderly man who had lost control of his vehicle and didn't understand what had happened. Michael arrived 10 minutes later, driving faster than the parking lot speed limit in his obvious eagerness to document this incident. He parked nearby and approached me with his smartphone already recording. "Dad, what happened here? Your car is parked really strangely." "I don't know," I said, genuinely confused sounding. "I was trying to park, and the steering wheel didn't seem to respond right. The car just went where it wanted to go." Michael walked around my car, filming everything. "Dad, look at how you're parked. You're taking up 2 spaces, and you're not even between the lines. This is exactly the kind of thing we've been worried about." "Is it? I thought I parked normally." What Michael was documenting was indeed evidence of poor parking, but what he didn't realize was that I had parked this way deliberately. More importantly, his response wasn't to help me figure out what might be wrong with the car or to suggest we call a mechanic. His response was to document my failure and use it as evidence of incompetence. "Dad, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your driving. This isn't safe for you or for other people." "But I need my car, Michael. How would I get around without it?" "There are other options, Dad. Ride services, public transportation, family members who can drive you places. The important thing is that you don't hurt yourself or someone else." I let him guide me to his car, playing the role of a confused old man who didn't understand why his parking had become an issue. But I was actually studying Michael's behavior, watching how quickly he moved from helping me to building a case against my competence. During the drive back to my house, Michael asked seemingly casual questions that I recognized as intelligence gathering. "Dad, have you had any other problems with the car lately? Any confusion about where you were going or trouble remembering how to get places?" "Well, last week I got a little mixed up coming back from the doctor's office, took a wrong turn and ended up in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. This was completely fabricated, but Michael seized on it immediately." "That's concerning, Dad. What if you'd gotten lost and couldn't find your way home? What if your phone battery had died?" "I suppose that could be a problem. Dad, I think we need to schedule a meeting with the whole family to discuss some changes that might help keep you safer." There it was. The parking incident I'd staged had given them exactly the ammunition they needed to call a family meeting where they would present their case for guardianship. "What kind of changes?" I asked, maintaining my confused persona. "Just some adjustments to your daily routine. Ways to make sure you have the support you need as things get a little more challenging." "As things get more challenging." He couldn't even say, "as you decline mentally," to my face, but he was perfectly willing to use my supposed decline to justify stealing my independence. After Michael left, promising to call later with details about the family meeting, I reviewed the surveillance footage Walter's team had captured. The cameras had perfectly documented Michael's eager recording of my parking difficulties, his leading questions about other driving problems, and his immediate pivot to discussing family meetings and support systems. But more importantly, the footage showed something Michael hadn't noticed in his excitement. My car was mechanically perfect. There was no steering problem, no mechanical malfunction that would explain my poor parking. Any automotive expert reviewing this footage would immediately recognize that the parking issue was deliberate rather than evidence of driver incompetence. Walter called me an hour later. "Owen, we got everything." Michael recorded the whole incident on his phone, and our cameras captured him recording it. We also got audio of your conversation in his car. This is perfect evidence of someone manufacturing a crisis to support a predetermined narrative. What about his phone recording? That's the beautiful part. Michael's recording actually works against him because it shows he was more interested in documenting your problems than in helping you solve them. No concerned son would focus on filming his father's difficulties instead of addressing them. That evening, Rebecca called with the expected invitation. "Dad," Michael told me about the parking incident today. "We're all a little worried about your safety. Would you be able to come to dinner at my house on Friday? We'd like to have a family discussion about some options that might help you feel more secure." Options? What kind of options? Just some. Ideas about ways to make your daily life easier and safer. Nothing dramatic, just some adjustments that might give you more peace of mind. More peace of mind. As if having my children steal my autonomy would somehow make me feel better about my life. Of course, sweetheart, I'll be there. After hanging up, I realized that my children had accelerated their timeline dramatically. They were moving from planning to implementation within days rather than weeks. The parking incident had convinced them that they now had sufficient evidence to support their guardianship petition, but they had no idea that every step of their conspiracy was being documented in detail. Every phone call, every family meeting, every false expression of concern was being recorded with timestamps and date stamps that would be admissible in court. I spent that evening reviewing all the evidence I'd accumulated. Audio recordings of their strategy sessions at Tony's Tavern, video footage of their manufacturing incidents to support their narrative, financial documents proving their desperate need for money, email correspondence showing their premeditated plan to steal my assets. By Friday evening, they would present their carefully rehearsed intervention, expecting to overwhelm a confused old man with coordinated family pressure. They would offer their solution: assisted living, loss of driving privileges, guardianship for my own protection, expecting gratitude for their willingness to manage my declining years. What they would actually be walking into was a trap that had been months in the making. If you're still following this story, I hope you're subscribing to the channel, because what happens next will shock you as much as it shocked them. The family meeting they were planning would indeed change everything, but not in the way they expected. I was about to show 3 adult children what happened when they declared war on a father who had spent 35 years managing much more complicated problems than their simple greed and deception. The final phase was about to begin. Friday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of a Michigan winter night. I dressed carefully for Rebecca's dinner, choosing clothes that made me appear slightly more fragile than usual. A cardigan with a small stain I hadn't bothered to clean, pants that were a little loose around the waist, shoes that had seen better days. If my children wanted to see a declining old man, I would give them exactly the visual evidence they expected. But hidden in my jacket pocket was my smartphone, set to record everything that would happen over the next few hours. And Walter's surveillance team was positioned outside Rebecca's house, ready to document whatever transpired. I arrived at 6 p.m. exactly, carrying a store-bought pie because I'd mentioned to Rebecca that baking was becoming too complicated for me to manage alone. Another small piece of evidence in their narrative of my declining competence. Rebecca greeted me with the kind of overly enthusiastic hug that screamed performance for witnesses. Michael and Jennifer were already there, along with David and his girlfriend Sarah, a new addition to family gatherings that suggested they wanted as many witnesses as possible for whatever they were planning. "Dad, you look—" Rebecca paused as if searching for the right words. "You look tired. Are you sleeping okay?" "Oh, you know, some nights are better than others. I think I've been worrying too much about little things." The dinner conversation was surreal. My children and their partners discussed my life like I was a child who needed adult supervision. They asked questions about my daily routine, my grocery shopping, my ability to manage household tasks. Each question was designed to establish a record of my supposed incompetence. "Dad, Michael mentioned you had some trouble parking the other day," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with false concern. "That must have been scary for you." "It was confusing," I admitted. "I thought I was parking normally, but apparently I wasn't." "Has that happened before?" David asked, leaning forward with obvious interest. "Problems with spatial awareness or judging distances?" The clinical language he was using suggested they'd been coached by their lawyer about what kind of evidence they needed to establish incompetence. "Well, sometimes I do feel like things aren't quite where I expect them to be." I was improvising now, giving them more ammunition while actually building my own case. Every leading question, every obvious attempt to manufacture evidence was being recorded for future use. After dinner, Rebecca suggested we move to the living room for a family conversation. The adults arranged themselves in a circle while the children were sent to another room to watch television. The staging was deliberate. This was meant to feel like an intervention. Michael took the lead, pulling out a folder that I recognized as the documentation they'd been building against me. "Dad, we asked you here tonight because we're all concerned about your safety and well-being. Over the past few months, we've noticed some changes that worry us." "What kind of changes?" "Memory issues, confusion about time and dates, difficulty with everyday tasks like operating the television or parking your car. We think it might be time to consider some additional support in your daily life." Rebecca nodded sympathetically. "We've been researching options that might help you feel more secure and less isolated. There are some wonderful facilities where you could have professional care available 24 hours a day, plus social activities and meal services. Facilities. They couldn't even say nursing home directly to my face. You want me to move out of my house?" David leaned forward. "Dad, your house is becoming too much for you to manage safely. What if you fell and no one found you for hours? What if you left the stove on and started a fire? We're worried about your safety," Jennifer added, "and driving is becoming a real concern. After what happened in the parking lot, we think it might be time to consider giving up your license voluntarily before something more serious happens." They were presenting this as a coordinated family decision made out of love and concern. But I could see the calculation in their eyes, the satisfaction at finally implementing their plan. "What would happen to my house, my car, my things?" "We'd take care of all of that for you," Michael assured me. "Sell the house, use the proceeds to pay for your care, make sure all your belongings are properly managed. You wouldn't have to worry about any of the complicated financial details, and we've already spoken to a lawyer about setting up guardianship arrangements," Rebecca added. "That way, if you ever become confused about important decisions, we can make sure your best interests are protected." Guardianship. They were openly discussing stealing my legal autonomy, and they expected me to be grateful for their willingness to manage my remaining years. "This is a lot to think about," I said slowly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make such big changes." The mood in the room shifted immediately. The fake sympathy disappeared, replaced by barely concealed impatience. "Dad," Michael's voice carried a new edge, "this isn't really optional anymore. We've documented multiple incidents where your judgment has been impaired. We have legal grounds to petition for emergency guardianship if you won't cooperate voluntarily. There it was, the threat they'd been building toward for months. Submit to their plan willingly, or they would use the courts to force compliance. What if I don't want to move to a facility? David's response revealed the depth of their preparation. Dad, you're not competent to make that decision anymore. We have evidence of dangerous behavior, declining mental function, and inability to manage daily tasks. A judge would agree that you need professional supervision. And if we have to go to court, Rebecca added, it'll be much more expensive and time-consuming for everyone. It's better if we can work this out as a family. They were giving me an ultimatum. Accept their plan voluntarily or face a legal battle they were confident they would win. But what they didn't realize was that every word of this conversation was being recorded. Their threats, their manufactured evidence, their admission that they'd already spoken to lawyers about guardianship, all of it was being documented with crystal clarity. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. How much time? Michael asked impatiently. Maybe a week. This is my whole life we're talking about. I need to process everything you've told me. They exchanged glances that I wasn't supposed to notice. They'd expected me to collapse under their coordinated pressure, to gratefully accept their solution. My request for time was disrupting their timeline. Dad, Rebecca said carefully, waiting too long isn't really an option. The facility we're recommending has immediate availability, but that might not last. And frankly, we're worried about what might happen if you continue living alone while your condition is deteriorating. A week, I repeated firmly. I think I deserve at least a week to consider such a major life change. After an uncomfortable silence, Michael nodded reluctantly. 1 week. But Dad, during that week, we're going to need to monitor your situation more closely, for your safety. What does that mean? Daily check-ins, supervision of activities like driving and cooking, maybe someone staying overnight to make sure you're okay. They were planning to establish a record of needed supervision during my decision week, building even more evidence for their legal case. I understand, I said quietly. As I prepared to leave, Rebecca hugged me with what she probably thought was convincing emotion. Dad, I know this is hard, but we're only suggesting this because we love you. We want to make sure you're safe and well cared for. The drive home gave me time to process everything that had happened. My children had moved from planning to implementation, from documentation to direct threats. They were confident that they had sufficient evidence to force their plan through the courts if I didn't comply voluntarily. But they had also just provided me with the final pieces of evidence I needed to destroy their conspiracy completely. Back home, I uploaded the evening's recording to my secure files and called Walter. Walter, they've made their move. Full intervention, ultimatum, threats of forced guardianship, everything recorded. What's your plan now, Owen? I looked around my house, my home for 30 years, filled with memories of raising children who had grown up to become strangers, willing to steal from their own father. My plan is to give them exactly 1 week to reveal their true nature, completely. And then I'm going to show them what justice looks like when it's served by someone who actually understands how to solve problems. The final week was about to begin, and by the time it ended, my children would understand that they had declared war on the wrong man. The week that followed Rebecca's dinner was like living in a surveillance state run by my own children. They implemented their monitoring for safety plan with military precision, taking shifts to ensure I was never alone for more than a few hours at a time. Monday morning, Michael arrived at 8 a.m. with coffee and donuts, ostensibly to check in, but actually to observe my morning routine and document any signs of confusion or incompetence. He followed me around the house, taking notes on his phone about my activities. Dad, I noticed you're having trouble with the coffee maker, he observed when I deliberately fumbled with the controls. Maybe we should get you something simpler. It's just, there are so many buttons. I used to know how it worked. Michael's satisfaction was visible as he helped me make coffee, then typed notes about my declining ability to operate household appliances. What he didn't realize was that my hidden cameras were recording his documentation process, showing a man more interested in proving his father's incompetence than in actually helping him. Tuesday brought Rebecca, who arrived with a list of questions about my daily schedule, eating habits and sleep patterns. She presented it as helping us understand your needs better, but it was clearly a formal assessment designed to establish patterns of declining self-care. Dad, when was the last time you had a proper meal? Something more substantial than just soup or sandwiches? I'm not sure. Yesterday, maybe the day before. It's hard to keep track. Rebecca wrote down my response verbatim, building a record of poor nutrition and memory problems. But my surveillance system was recording her obvious coaching of my responses, showing how she asked leading questions designed to elicit evidence of incompetence. Wednesday was David's turn. He focused on my ability to manage household maintenance and safety, walking through the house with a checklist that covered everything from smoke detector batteries to the condition of handrails and lighting. Dad, this smoke detector is beeping. How long has it been doing that? Beeping? I hadn't noticed. In reality, I disabled the smoke detector that morning to create exactly this scenario. David's response wasn't to simply replace the battery. It was to document my failure to maintain basic safety equipment, then use that as evidence of my inability to live independently. Each day brought new tests, new opportunities for them to document my alleged decline. And each day I gave them exactly the evidence they wanted, while secretly recording their manipulation and exploitation of my apparent vulnerability. But Thursday night brought an unexpected escalation that revealed the true depth of their deception. Was in my kitchen, preparing a simple dinner and playing my role as a confused old man who struggled with basic tasks, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw David approaching my house with someone I didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman in professional clothing carrying a briefcase. They knocked on my front door, and when I answered, David introduced his companion with barely concealed excitement. Dad, this is Dr. Sandra Weiss. She's a geriatric specialist who works with families dealing with cognitive decline issues. I thought it might be helpful for her to meet you and assess your current situation. Dr. Weiss smiled with professional warmth. Mr. Harris, your son has expressed some concerns about your well-being. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. This was it, the formal psychological evaluation they needed to support their guardianship petition. They were bringing in a professional to document my alleged mental incompetence. I suppose that would be fine, I said hesitantly. For the next hour, Dr. Weiss conducted what appeared to be a routine cognitive assessment. She asked me questions about current events, recent memories, problem-solving scenarios, and daily living activities. Her approach was professional and seemingly neutral. But I noticed something interesting. David remained in the room throughout the entire evaluation, occasionally prompting Dr. Weiss with leading information about incidents I'd supposedly experienced. Doctor, you should know that Dad had a significant driving incident earlier this week, David interjected. He parked across 2 spaces and seemed confused about what had happened. And he's been having trouble with household appliances, David added later. The television remote, the coffee maker, basic things he used to handle easily. Dr. Weiss nodded and made notes. But I could see she was being influenced by David's commentary. She wasn't conducting an objective assessment. She was documenting problems that David was directing her attention toward. After Dr. Weiss left, David stayed behind to discuss her visit. Dad, I think that went well. Dr. Weiss seemed to understand the challenges you're facing. What kind of challenges? The memory issues, the confusion about daily tasks, the safety concerns. She's going to prepare a report that will help us make sure you get the support you need. The report, another piece of professional documentation to support their legal case. But what David didn't know was that my surveillance system had recorded the entire evaluation, including his obvious coaching of Dr. Weiss's assessment. Any attorney reviewing this footage would immediately recognize it as a compromised evaluation designed to produce predetermined results. Friday brought the final phase of their monitoring week. All three of my children arrived together, carrying folders and wearing expressions of coordinated concern. "Dad," Michael began, "we've completed our assessment of your living situation, and we're all convinced that immediate action is necessary. For your safety." Rebecca pulled out a typewritten document. "We've prepared a care plan that addresses all the issues we've identified this week: professional supervision, medical monitoring, assistance with daily activities, and a safe living environment. The facility in Pontiac has confirmed they can accept you as early as Monday," David added. "Dr. Weiss's preliminary assessment supports our recommendation for immediate placement in a supervised environment." They were presenting their ultimatum with the confidence of people who believed they had built an unassailable case. Professional, medical opinion, documented safety incidents, recorded evidence of declining competence, everything a court would need to support emergency guardianship. "And if I refuse?" I asked quietly. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, Michael opened his folder and pulled out legal documents that made my blood run cold. "Dad, we've already filed preliminary paperwork with the county probate court. If you won't accept help voluntarily, we'll petition for emergency guardianship on Monday morning." Rebecca's voice carried false sadness. "We don't want to force this through the courts, but we can't stand by and watch you put yourself in danger." David leaned forward with what he probably thought was convincing sincerity. "Dad, Dr. Weiss's evaluation will support our petition. Combined with all the incidents we've documented this week, a judge will agree that you need immediate supervision." They were so confident in their manipulation, so certain that their manufactured evidence would convince any court that their father was incompetent. They had no idea that every conversation, every staged incident, every coached evaluation had been recorded in detail. "I need to understand something," I said slowly. "If you become my guardians, what happens to my house? My savings, my pension?" Michael's answer revealed everything I needed to know about their true motivations. "All of your assets would be managed for your benefit, Dad. The house would be sold to pay for your care, your pension would be redirected to cover facility costs, and your savings would be professionally managed to ensure they last as long as possible." "And who would make those decisions?" "We would," Rebecca said simply. "As your guardians, we'd have legal authority to make all financial and medical decisions on your behalf." "What if I wanted to leave the facility? What if I wanted to move? Somewhere else?" David's smile was cold. "Dad, once you're in professional care, those kinds of decisions would be made by medical professionals and family members who understand your condition. You wouldn't need to worry about complicated choices anymore." They were describing a prison sentence disguised as care. Once they gained guardianship, I would have no legal rights, no financial control, no decision-making authority over my own life. I would be completely dependent on the mercy of children who had already demonstrated they had none. "I have until Monday to decide?" "Actually," Michael said, consulting his watch, "we need your answer by Sunday evening. If you're going to cooperate voluntarily, we need time to complete the paperwork. If you're going to force us to go through the courts, we need to file additional documents Monday morning. They were accelerating their timeline, pushing for a decision that would either give them what they wanted immediately or position them for a legal victory they were certain they would achieve. "Sunday evening," I repeated. "I understand." After they left, I sat in my kitchen reviewing the recordings from their final ultimatum. Their arrogance was breathtaking. They were so convinced that I was helpless, confused, and vulnerable that they had essentially confessed to conspiracy, elder abuse, and fraud while believing they were simply managing an incompetent old man. But Saturday morning brought a surprise that revealed just how far they were willing to go to ensure their plan succeeded. I was having my morning coffee when I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I saw not just my children's vehicles, but also a van marked Allied Moving Services and several workers beginning to unload boxes and packing materials. Michael, Rebecca, and David approached my front door together, their expressions set with grim determination. "Dad," Michael announced when I answered, "we've decided that waiting until Monday isn't safe. We're going to help you pack today so you can move to the facility tomorrow." But I haven't agreed to anything. Yet Rebecca's mask of false sympathy had finally slipped. "Dad, you're not competent to make this decision. We're implementing emergency measures for your own protection." They were moving forward with their plan regardless of my consent, confident that their manufactured evidence would protect them from any legal consequences. "You can't just take me out of my house against my will." David's response chilled me to the bone. "Dad, we absolutely can. We have medical documentation of your incompetence, recorded evidence of dangerous behavior, and legal authority to act in your best interest. If you resist, we'll call the police and explain that you're a confused elderly man who needs emergency medical intervention." They had thought of everything. If I resisted their forced kidnapping, they would claim I was having a mental health crisis that required immediate professional intervention. But as I watched the moving crew begin carrying boxes toward my house, I realized they had made one final crucial mistake. They were so confident in their conspiracy that they were implementing it in broad daylight with multiple witnesses, while my surveillance system recorded every moment of their forced seizure of my property and person. What they thought was their moment of victory was actually going to be the evidence that destroyed them completely. I looked at my 3 children, the babies I had raised, the adults I had supported, the criminals who had decided to steal my remaining years for their financial benefit, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "You know what?" I said calmly. "You're absolutely right. I can't fight all 3 of you, and I can't fight the legal system if you're determined to do this." Their relief was visible. Michael actually smiled. "Dad, you're making the right choice. This is going to be better for everyone." "I'm sure it will be," I agreed. "Just give me a few minutes to gather some personal items, and then I'll cooperate fully with whatever you think is best." As I walked back into my house, I heard Rebecca tell the moving crew to begin packing immediately. They thought they had won. They thought their careful planning, their manufactured evidence, and their coordinated pressure had finally broken down the resistance of a confused old man. They had no idea that their confused old man had spent the last months building a case that would send all 3 of them to prison for elder abuse, conspiracy, and fraud. The final phase was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything they had imagined possible. I walked calmly to my bedroom, closing the door behind me as the sounds of moving boxes and my children's coordinated theft echoed through my house. But instead of packing personal items, I pulled out my smartphone and made the call I'd been preparing for months. "Walter, they're here. Full implementation, moving trucks, forced eviction, everything we discussed. Are you ready? Teams are in. Position, Owen. Local police, FBI field office, and senior services investigators. Everything's being documented from multiple angles. You sure you want to go through with this?" I looked around my bedroom. The room I'd shared with Sarah for 25 years, where we'd planned our children's futures and dreamed about grandchildren who would visit their grandfather with love instead of calculating his net worth. I'm sure. Initiate Phase 3. What my children didn't know was that Walter's security background included connections throughout Michigan's law enforcement community. When a decorated former plant security chief reported a conspiracy involving elder abuse, fraud, and forced institutionalization, people listened. For the past week, while my children had been implementing their surveillance and building their case for my incompetence, I had been working with Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos to document a criminal conspiracy that included dozens of felony charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio recordings of their planning sessions at Tony's Tavern, video footage of them manufacturing incidents to support their incompetence narrative, financial records proving their desperate need for money, email correspondence showing premeditated intent to steal my assets, Dr. Weiss's compromised evaluation, coached by David's leading commentary, and now surveillance footage of them forcibly removing me from my home based on fabricated evidence of mental incompetence. I gathered a small bag of actual personal items, not because I was going anywhere with them, but because I needed to maintain my role for a few more minutes. When I returned to the living room, the transformation was shocking. Professional movers were systematically packing my belongings while my children supervised with clipboards and inventories. They were documenting every item, every piece of furniture, every personal possession, not because they cared about my comfort in my new facility, but because they were cataloging assets they planned to liquidate. "Dad," Rebecca called out cheerfully, "we're making sure all your important things are properly packed. Don't worry about any of the details." Michael was on his phone with what sounded like the facility in Pontiac. "Yes, we'll have him there by this evening. Emergency placement, just like we discussed. The payment arrangements are all set up. They had already arranged to pay for my imprisonment using my own money." David approached me with a folder of papers. "Dad, I need you to sign a few documents, just routine paperwork to make the transition smoother." I glanced at the papers without reading them carefully, knowing that Walter's legal team had already reviewed identical documents obtained through discovery. They were financial authorizations that would give my children immediate access to all my accounts. "What am I signing?" I asked, maintaining my confused persona. "Just permission for us to handle your financial obligations while you're getting settled in your new place. Utility transfers, bank notifications, that kind of thing. They were asking me to voluntarily sign away my financial autonomy while their moving crew stole my possessions." "I suppose that makes sense," I said, reaching for the pen. That's when the front door exploded with activity. "Police! Everyone remain where you are and keep your hands visible." 6 officers in tactical gear flooded into my living room, followed by FBI agents in windbreakers and senior services investigators with cameras. The moving crew dropped their boxes and raised their hands. My children froze like deer in headlights. "This is Agent Patricia Collins, FBI Financial Crimes Unit," announced a tall woman with steel-gray hair. "We're executing warrants for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation." Michael found his voice first. "What's going on here? We're helping our father move to a care facility. This is a family matter." Agent Collins looked at him with the expression of someone who'd seen every variation of this excuse. "Mr. Harris, you and your siblings are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable adult. You have the right to remain silent." The next 20 minutes were chaos. Miranda rights being read, handcuffs, my children's protests and demands to call their lawyers, the moving crew being questioned as witnesses, boxes being sealed as evidence. Rebecca was crying, insisting that everything they'd done was for my protection. "He's not competent to live alone. We were trying to help him." David was angry, threatening lawsuits and claiming harassment. "This is a setup. Our father called the police because he's confused about what's happening." Michael was calculating. already thinking like someone who understood the legal trouble they were facing. We have documentation, medical evaluations, evidence of his declining mental capacity. Agent Collins listened to their explanations with professional patience, then looked at me. Mr. Harris, are you Owen Harris, age 61, of 1247 Maple Street? Sir. Do you understand what's happening here today? I straightened up, dropping the confused old man persona I'd maintained for months. When I spoke, my voice was clear, strong, and absolutely certain. Agent Collins, what's happening here is that 3 adults who happen to be my biological children have spent months planning to steal my assets, destroy my autonomy, and warehouse me in a facility against my will. They manufactured evidence of mental incompetence, coached medical evaluations, and were in the process of forcibly removing me from my home when you arrived. The silence in the room was profound. My children stared at me as if they were seeing a stranger. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who would be grateful for their management of his declining years. I continued. What they were actually dealing with was someone who spent 35 years managing complex problems and difficult people. Someone who knows how to gather evidence, build cases, and solve challenges they never imagined possible. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Dad, you're not confused. You're not incompetent. I never was. Every incident you documented, every sign of decline you recorded, every piece of evidence you gathered, all of it was performance designed to let you reveal your true intentions. Michael's face was white with understanding. You knew. The whole time, you knew what we were planning. I knew from the moment I overheard your conversation at your house in November, when you called me useless and discussed your plans to steal my life's work. I spent months gathering evidence of your conspiracy while letting you think you were documenting my incompetence. David's voice cracked. Dad, we never meant. We thought we were helping. You thought you were stealing from someone too weak to fight back. You calculated the value of my life down to the last dollar and planned to spend my money before I was even dead. Agent Collins stepped forward. Mr. Harris, we have extensive documentation of the conspiracy you've described. Audio recordings, video surveillance, financial records, email correspondence. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement? I looked at my 3 children, handcuffed, crying, finally understanding that their victim had been their prosecutor. All along, Agent Collins, I've been preparing for this statement for months. I have evidence that will support dozens of felony charges against each of them. As the FBI agents led my children away, Rebecca called out one final desperate plea. Dad, we're your family. You can't do this to your own children. I watched them disappear into police cars, thinking about the family we used to be before they decided my love was worth less than my money. You stopped being my family when you decided I was more valuable as a victim than as a father, I said to their empty cars. The house fell quiet except for the investigators photographing evidence and the senior services coordinator explaining the resources available to help me understand my rights and options. But for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Peace. The war was over, and justice had been served not through violence or cruelty, but through patience, intelligence, and the careful application of consequences to people who had forgotten that actions have results. My children had underestimated their father one final time, and this time, that mistake would cost them everything. 6 months later, I sat in the same kitchen where this story began, but everything had changed. The November evening that had started with my children calling me useless had led to a spring morning where justice had finally been served. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Michael, Rebecca, and David each pled guilty to conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, and attempted theft. The evidence I'd gathered over months of careful documentation left their attorneys no choice but to negotiate plea agreements. Michael received 3 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $50,000 in restitution. His house in Troy was foreclosed, his marriage to Jennifer ended in divorce, and his career in sales was destroyed by his felony conviction. Rebecca got 2 years in community service, plus $30,000 in restitution. She and Tom lost their house anyway, despite their efforts to steal my money to save it. Her children were staying with Tom's parents while she served her sentence. David received the harshest punishment, 4 years in prison, as his fake contracting. Business had defrauded multiple elderly victims beyond just his conspiracy against me. The state licensing board permanently banned him from electrical work, and he faced additional civil lawsuits from his other victims. Dr. Sandra Weiss lost her license to practice psychology after the investigation revealed that David had paid her $5,000 to conduct a biased evaluation designed to support their guardianship petition. She pled guilty to professional misconduct and fraud, but the most satisfying part wasn't their punishment. It was how the truth had finally been revealed. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the elder abuse conspiracy, praising law enforcement for protecting vulnerable seniors and exposing family members who exploit their parents' trust. I was interviewed as an example of how seniors can protect themselves by staying alert and documenting suspicious behavior. Owen Harris appeared to be a confused old man losing his mental capacity, the reporter wrote. In reality, he was a strategic thinker gathering evidence to expose a criminal conspiracy. His case has become a model for how law enforcement and senior advocates can work together to protect vulnerable adults. The story spread through social media, making my children infamous as examples of the worst kind of family betrayal. Their friends, neighbors, and former colleagues now knew exactly what they had tried to do to their own father. But even with justice served, I struggled with the finality of what had happened. These were still the children I had raised, the babies I had rocked to sleep, the young adults I had helped through college and early career challenges. Walter visited me regularly during those difficult months, helping me process the loss of my family alongside the satisfaction of defeating their conspiracy. "Oh, and do you regret how this ended?" he asked one Thursday morning over coffee at Mel's diner. I thought about his question for a long time. "Walter, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my children chose greed over love. I regret that they saw me as an obstacle to wealth, rather than as a father who deserved respect. But do you regret fighting back?" No. If I had let them succeed, I would have spent my remaining years in a facility, medicated and forgotten, while they spent my life savings on their debts and luxuries. They would have stolen not just my money, but my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to live my own life on my own terms. The house felt different now, quieter, but more peaceful. I'd kept all of Sarah's belongings exactly where she'd left them, and I often found myself talking to her photograph about the choices I'd made. "Sarah, I hope you understand what I did. I know you always wanted me to put the children first, but they stopped being our children when they decided to steal from their father. They became criminals who happened to share our DNA. I established a routine that brought me genuine contentment. Morning coffee while reading the newspaper. Afternoon walks through the neighborhood where neighbors who knew my story often stopped to chat and express their support. Evening visits to the library, where I was working on writing a book about elder abuse prevention. The book project had started as therapy, but evolved into something more important. I wanted other seniors to understand the warning signs of family, financial exploitation, the legal protections available to them, and the importance of documenting suspicious behavior. Elder abuse often begins with family members who convince themselves they're acting in your best interest, I wrote in the introduction. They use love as camouflage for greed and concern as justification for theft. But seniors who stay alert, gather evidence, and trust their instincts can protect themselves from even the most sophisticated family conspiracies. On a warm Saturday morning in May, I received an unexpected letter. The return address showed the federal prison where Michael was serving his sentence. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before deciding to open it. "Dad," the letter began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to make excuses for what we did. I'm writing because I need you to know that I finally understand the magnitude of our betrayal." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Michael's realization of how wrong they had been, his regret for the pain they had caused, and his acknowledgement that I had been right to fight back. "Prison has given me time to think about who I became and how far I strayed from the values you and Mom taught us. We convinced ourselves we were helping you, but we were really just solving our own problems at your expense. You deserved better from the children you raised with such love and sacrifice." Michael's letter ended with a request that surprised me. "Dad, I don't expect you to forgive us, and I don't expect you to ever want to see us again. But if you're willing, I would like permission to call you when I'm released. Not to ask for money or help, but to apologize in person for the son I became." I set the letter aside and walked to my back porch, where Sarah's garden was blooming with spring flowers. The irony wasn't lost on me. The children who had planned to warehouse me in a facility were now the ones living in institutions, while their father enjoyed the freedom they had tried to steal. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about Michael's letter and the possibility of reconciliation. Did I want my children back in my life after everything they had done? Could I ever trust them again? Was forgiveness possible after such a complete betrayal? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my revenge had already been perfect. Not because I had sent them to prison, but because I had forced them to confront the truth about what they had become. They had seen me as weak, confused, and easy to manipulate. I had shown them that strength sometimes looks like vulnerability, and that the wisest strategy is often to let your enemies reveal their true nature before you respond. They had planned to steal my autonomy, my dignity, and my remaining years. I had preserved all 3 while teaching them the real cost of betraying someone who loves them. 3 weeks after receiving Michael's letter, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wrote him back. "Michael," I wrote, "what you and your siblings did was unforgivable. You planned to steal my freedom, my money, and my dignity. You were willing to warehouse me in a facility against my will so you could solve your financial problems with my life savings. But forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I choose to do with the anger and hurt you caused. I choose not to carry that burden for the rest of my life. When you're released from prison, you may call me, not because I trust you, not because I'm ready to be your father again, but because everyone deserves a chance to prove they've learned from their mistakes. You will never again have access to my financial information, my house keys, or my medical decisions. You will never again have the power to hurt me the way you did. But if you can prove that prison taught you something about honor, respect, and family loyalty, maybe we can build something new from the ashes of what you destroyed." I mailed the letter on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week when my children used to meet at Tony's Tavern to plan my destruction. The symbolism felt appropriate. That evening, I called Walter to tell him about my decision. "Owen, are you sure about this? After everything they put you through?" "Walter, the most powerful revenge isn't sending someone to prison. The most powerful revenge is becoming so strong, so independent, and so content that their betrayal can't touch your happiness. And if they try to hurt you again?" I smiled, Thinking about the surveillance system still protecting my house, the legal protections now in place, and the network of friends and professionals who knew my story and watched out for my welfare. They'll discover that the useless old man they underestimated is still 10 steps ahead of anything they could possibly plan. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my story wasn't really about revenge at all. It was about dignity, self-respect, and the refusal to let other people, even family members, define your worth or control your future. My children had called me useless and planned to steal my remaining years. I had shown them that a man who builds his own strength, protects his own interests, and fights his own battles is the opposite of useless. He was Owen Harris, 62 years old, living independently in the house I had chosen, with friends who respected me and resources I controlled. I was exactly who I had always been, a man who solved problems, protected what mattered, and never gave up when faced with challenges. The children who had planned to warehouse me were in prison. The father they had underestimated was free, and that I realized was the sweetest victory of all. And you? What would you have done in my situation? Would you have confronted your children immediately, or would you have gathered evidence like I did? Would you have been able to forgive them after such a betrayal, or would you have cut them out of your life forever? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced family members who took advantage of your trust? How did you handle it? If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with others who might need to hear it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be a victim, even when the people trying to victimize you are the ones you love most. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember, you're never too old to fight back, and you're never too trusting to protect yourself. Family isn't defined by DNA, it's defined by love, respect, and loyalty. And anyone who doesn't understand that doesn't deserve to be called family.